1. Quick background. I'm a 19-year-old female, and due to being a competitive dancer in high school, and crazy infection in my hip when I was young, I sometimes use a cane to get around. It comes and goes. In this story, it was at a time when I was heavily relying on my cane. So I had just gotten off work and got my paycheck, and decided to run to Walmart and get myself some snacks and other necessities. I live way up north, so it's a bit of a drive, so when I do run into town, I browse for a while. It's also around 9:30 by the time I get to the store, so it's mostly deserted. I end up looking at the movie section when a guy comes right up behind me and says hi. Simple enough, but the lack of personal space gives me a weird vibe, so I mumble a hello, and continue deciding which movies I want. I step away from my cart a bit to look at some movies farther down. He was across the aisle, but is back behind me again and says hi once more. I turn around and size him up quickly. He's a good 6 inches taller than me and slightly overweight. I am not very easily intimidated, but given his size and my reliance on my cane, he'd have an easy fight. Taking a limp away from him, I respond, "Hello, how are you today? What are you looking at?" He's now standing between me and my cart in an odd way, as if to keep me from it so I'll talk to him longer. It was weird. I'm fine, just picking up some movies to watch later. I have the case to make my point. It was the Lego Batman movie. I try to casually put it in my cart, but he sidesteps and blocks me. "Do you watch anime?" I give him a stupid look that should make it obvious I don't want to be in this conversation. No, I turn my back and look at more movies, trying to end this weird interaction. "Do you want to watch it?" I mutter my no without turning to face him. Worst comes to worst, I have my cane in my purse, so all of my personal possessions are on me. But I have a cart full of stuff that I don't want to run around and re-grab. "Why not?" I turn to face him, no longer keeping my annoyance off my face. "Because I don't want to. I've had a long day at work and want to relax." "Oh, where do you work?" "A grocery store." I'm now mindlessly looking at these damn movies, trying to act like I'm not trying to grab my cart and speed out of that aisle. "Is it around here? What shift?" I'm over it. I don't respond and once again try to grab my cart, which he is still blocking. "Why won't you answer me?" "Listen, buddy, I'm not into this. I want to go home." He looks shocked. How could I be so rude to such a nice guy? "Well, even when you're being rude, you're still beautiful." "Do you know how beautiful you are?" "Yeah, I know. You're in the way of my cart. Please move." "Is that how you respond to a compliment?" He shoots me a trying to be condescending in a sexy way look. "Is how I respond to a fact. I'm beautiful. I know. You're in the way of my cart." He glances at my cane again, which he's been looking at almost as often as my tits. "You know, if I was some creepy guy, I would point out how since you use a cane, you'd be an easy target. But I'm not a creepy guy. Thank God for you, right?" He laughs as if I'd finally see how nice he is and realize how shitty I'm being to this knight in shining armor. I'm looking shocked at him for a few seconds, like the lack of self-awareness baffles me into silence. "It's really fucking creepy that you just said that. Normal people don't say shit like that." He reaches for my waist. I take a small step back. He starts to say something sounding like, "Come on, don't be like that." I harshly step back again. Don't touch me!" At this point in his attempt to get closer to me, he's left a gap for me to squeeze through and grab my cart. This motherfucker tries to grab my cane, and I lose it. I put my hand on my cart for balance and raise my cane at him. "You must be fucked up if you think that's okay. Get away from me. Get the fuck away from me." I shout at him as he retreats out of the aisle. A female employee who must have been nearby came over and asked me if I'm okay. I tell her some creep was bothering me and tried to grab my cane. Told her I was fine, and just wanted to check out and go home. She walks with me to the front and then to my car so I'm not alone. And I head home and watch a movie. So to the guy who doesn't think it's creepy to grab someone's cane, let's not meet again. 2. Around 10 years ago, I was 13 and had just entered the 8th grade. During this time, my grandmother moved into an apartment complex in my town to be closer to us in her old age, mid-80s. I loved to spend time there with her, and at one point I was staying there every single night. I'd wake up at 5 each morning to get ready for one of my parents to pick me up for school at 6. I hadn't been able to really see my grandmother much in years leading up to that, so I always jumped at the chance to stay with her. She and I got along beautifully. We would cook together, watch movies, tell stories and jokes. We loved being in each other's company. And we were as close as anyone could possibly be to a loved one. That's why it was so hard for me to tell anyone what had happened. I thought that if my parents knew, I wouldn't be able to stay with my grandmother in the apartment complex anymore. I had this aunt who also lived in the apartments, but on the 3rd floor instead of the 1st, where my grandmother lived. My aunt had been there for much longer than my grandmother, and so naturally she had befriended some of her neighbors. One such neighbor was a creepy guy in his 50s that always looked like he was just dripping with grease. He had oily, slicked-back hair that he always kept hidden under one of those mesh trucker hats. His teeth were stained yellow, he was never clean-shaven. And he had thick bifocal glasses that made his eyes look weird and buggy. Because he was friends with my aunt, he was always around. The first time I encountered this guy, I was sitting in the floor of my aunt's apartment while I played with her dog. She went across the hall to bring him in and introduce us because she was so excited that I was visiting her. When he came in, he sat on the sofa and kind of looked me up and down before gushing that I was gorgeous and asking my age. I didn't think anything of it because that's how my aunt always spoke to me. I told him that I was 13, and he plastered a huge, toothy grin on his face. He held up his open hand with 5 fingers out and said to me, "Only 5 more years and then we can get married." At that point I was uncomfortable. I felt like he was joking, but it was such a weird thing to say. I offered that polite, kind of forced laugh and went back to playing with my aunt's dog. Unfortunately, that was not the only gross encounter I had with this guy. The following month and a half or so kept my stomach in knots. He was always at my aunt's apartment. He would say things like, "Hey, gorgeous," and "There's a pretty little thing." It was the casual way that he said it that made my skin crawl. I eventually stopped going to my aunt's apartment and instead had her come and visit me and my grandmother down on the 1st floor. It didn't take long before he began showing up at my grandmother's place. He came under the guise of being some sort of helpful handyman, and would always ask my grandmother if she needed anything done around her place. She'd find him odd jobs and invite him in, and I'd duck into a different room. These visits became more and more frequent, and he eventually started coming down without my aunt just to visit with Grandma for a while. Every time he'd see me, he'd call me by some kind of cheesy pet name, and he constantly kept saying 5 more years, like it was some kind of cute inside joke between us. At one point, as he was walking by me, he put his hands on the small of my back. I felt ice cold. I eventually told my grandmother that I didn't like him and that he was creepy. She started sending him away at the door, saying that she was tired or that she didn't need anything done at the moment. I was so relieved by that, and genuinely thought that the weird situation wouldn't escalate, and I wouldn't have to say anything to my parents. A short amount of time went by, and I decided to go upstairs to visit my aunt. When I walked into the elevator, there was that creepy guy. He always had this nasty way of looking me up and down, and it was always exaggerated by his bifocal glasses. He greeted me with the very casual, "Hey, gorgeous." I nodded at him to be polite, and hurried down the hall to my aunt's apartment. Being in the elevator with him made me genuinely feel unsafe. All of this had happened in a relatively short span of time, and even as a young girl I could see that his behavior was escalating. The final straw was when he showed up in the middle of the night at my grandmother's door. We were both already in bed, and it was summertime, so I was sleeping in a tank top and some shorts. I heard a knocking at the door, and I remember being really pissed off that someone would be there so late. My first thought that was whoever it was would wake my grandmother, so I got up to go tell them to come back some other time. I should have looked through the peephole, because there in the doorway was Creepy Guy. Now, mind you, I was a 13-year-old girl and this was a grown man. He towered over me, and I could see him immediately look down at what I was wearing. I took an instinctive step back and kind of stood halfway between the door to protect my modesty, although what I was wearing wasn't really revealing at all. And he actually tried to push past me and come in. I felt my pulse in my ears. I could feel my whole face turning red, and just raw fear shoot through me. Thankfully, I had my body weight behind the door and resisted against it. I told him that my grandmother was sleeping and that he couldn't come in and wake her up. I don't even remember what excuse he had for being there, but I quickly shut the door and deadbolted it. At that point, I finally told my aunt, my grandmother, and my parents. They were outraged at the weird sweet talk, the staring, and the general creepiness. But they were especially angered by the fact that he came in the middle of the night, regardless of whatever feigned reason he had. It was the very next day that my parents and aunt talked to him. I wasn't there for obvious reasons, but from what they told me, they threatened to call the police if he ever came around me or anyone else in our family again. I was so relieved that my parents let me keep staying with my grandmother, and the scary guy stopped coming around when I finally mustered up the guts to speak up. The scary guy eventually moved out, and I lost track of him pretty quickly. So to the creep who harassed me a decade ago, please, let's not ever meet again. 3. It was my junior year of high school and I was new. Most people were very friendly, and honestly, regardless of this negative experience I had, I still think it was the best school I went to. I ended up hanging out with the skateboarders. Most of them were decent enough guys. We always had a great time listening to music and hitting up our local McD's after school. One of my best friends, Matt, had a twin brother named Will. Will, for some reason, didn't like me at all and was always rude to me. I tried asking Matt once why Will hated me so much, and he just said something like, "That's just how he is." Whatever, it wasn't my problem, and I never did anything to cause it, so I let it go. During the school year, I met a guy named Jesse. Jesse was odd, but he seemed harmless enough. Isn't that how all these stories start? So I wasn't too worried in the beginning. We rarely talked and were mostly just acquaintances until one day he came up to me in the hallway, handed me a note, and walked away. I was confused but headed to my class before I got a chance to read the note. When I got settled in at my desk, I opened the note. It was mostly nonsensical. He said things like, "I want to watch you get into arguments with your mom. You're really pretty. I think we'd be good together." And the strangest one, "I want to watch you play Uno by yourself." What the actual fuck? It wasn't until the end that I felt the wave of chills through my body. "I want to watch you in your room from outside your window." He ended the note with his signature and his phone number. No way, this had to be a joke. No one would write something so weird and be serious. I let it go, and my friends reassured me that he was just kind of weird. Will made fun of me for it. He found it hilarious. Jesse began showing up around my locker. It started out small, with just him being there one period. Then it turned into every period. Every time I was there, he popped up somewhere in the hall. Our lockers were on separate sides of the school, we had no classes together, and there was really no reason why he'd be showing up all the time. But he always made his presence known somehow. Sometimes I would feel someone watching me and look around to see him somewhere in the hall. Sometimes just standing there staring at me. I absolutely hate being stared at. It makes me uncomfortable. There's no particular reason, it's just always bothered me. I just tried to ignore him, and assumed it was part of his weird crush he had on me. Until he followed me home one day. He didn't talk to me, he just watched me walk to my house, which was just down the street from school. He stood across the street until I walked inside. Then he went back to the school to get home, wherever that was. I knew he never went that way, and was thoroughly creeped out. I never told anyone, but I knew he was aware of my house now. Was he going to show up? Would he watch me outside my window like he wanted to? I never saw him near my house again, but was still freaked out. A couple weeks later, I found a picture in my locker. It was hand-drawn and signed with Jesse's signature. The picture was creepy as hell, with an angry-looking snowman full of stab wounds that bled into a puddle around the bottom of it. I was really freaked out again. I let it go. I wasn't sure what I could even do. Thinking back, I should have told the teacher or the principal, but I wasn't the type to make waves and assumed he was just playing some kind of weird, sick joke. I showed my friends again, and they said it was creepy. They asked me if I wanted them to talk to Jesse for me, but I declined, again not wanting problems. After all, I was new at the school. Will didn't make fun of me this time, though. He looked angry when he saw it, but never said anything to me about it. After a couple more weeks during study hall, I asked my teacher if I could go in the hall to read since it was too distracting with the other kids talking. He let me, and I headed out. Will was sitting against the lockers, also wanting to get away from the noise. He looked up at me, then back down to his book. Typical Will. I sat a few lockers down and got comfortable to start reading my book. From down the hall I heard footsteps coming our way. I didn't look up since it's a pretty high traffic area because the bathrooms are close by. The footsteps stopped in front of me and I looked up to see Jesse looking down at me with a smile on his face and a folded up piece of paper in his hand. He leaned down and gave it to me. When I opened it, I was immediately upset all over again. It was another drawing, this time of a Care Bear with a butcher knife in one hand, his heart in the other, and a huge bloody hole in its chest. I looked up at Jesse, and he just smiled down at me in the most sinister way. I didn't know what to say, but I didn't have to. Will saw the picture and how upset I was. He stood up, walked over to Jesse, grabbed him by the shirt and slammed him against the lockers. "Leave her alone, and don't ever talk to her again or I'll beat the shit out of you," Will told Jesse angrily. I was completely dumbfounded. Will hated me. He never said one nice thing to me. Jesse was equally surprised by the reaction as he barely knew Will. He mumbled something and walked away. He never bothered me again, but still occasionally showed up around me at my locker. We never spoke after that. I didn't get any more notes or pictures, and he never followed me home again. I was thankful to the rudest person I knew for standing up for me and stepping in when I felt that I couldn't. I have grown into my own, having no problem standing up for myself, but I'm still thankful to Will for what he did. I never told him, but I think he knew. You're a decent artist, Jesse. Let's not meet. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 401. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. When do you guys get this one? I think this will be Wednesday, episode 401. Ooh, it doesn't seem that long ago since I was recording episode 1. All kind of shaky and nervous. Putting it up. I thought, oh, put it up. Should I delete it? No, somebody watched it. Maybe I should. Maybe it's not too late to delete it. Oh, someone said something nice. Okay, I'll leave it up then. Just past 400, of course. I'm assuming you all left nice feedback on it. I haven't actually. As recording this, it hasn't actually gone up yet. But I will just thank all of those of you who left nice feedback in advance for the nice feedback, because it was very nice of you. I'm trying to get these recordings done a little bit earlier. I'm technically on Sunday right now, and have a hospital appointment just to pick up the stuff from the dermatologist. I think I'll be up to the 20% dose today, or when I get that. And I want to do as little as possible when I get home, to be honest with you. So if I get my audio recorded and out the way, then the videos will be a lot quicker to make. And I can just relax and chill and maybe watch movies while I sit pretending to be a tar monster. Thank you to everyone who joined me for this stream on Saturday. We seem to have all the kinks worked out now. Although I did run into a couple of issues with the computer. I was on Sunday. I thought I'll test it out just playing regular games, and it kept freezing. But I adjusted some settings, and at the moment it seems alright. So I adjusted some settings in the BIOS, overclock things a wee bit, because I hadn't actually overclocked it yet. And hopefully that helps, but I'm sure I'll work it out if it isn't. Don't know what I'm going to do for the next stream. I also don't know when I'm going to do it. I'm getting a little bit bored with Google Earth. I don't know how you guys are feeling. I'm getting a little bit bored with it myself. I had planned on doing like a quiet drive around Los Angeles in LA Noire. But that game, for some reason, on the new computer build, when I try to start it up, it keeps giving me an error. But if I shut the virtual reality down and then start the game up from there, and let it start the VR up on its own, it'll work, which is weird. But that is at least a way to work it. I don't know how you guys would feel about this. I think it might be okay to do, is, if you remember, I've mentioned it, and some of you also may have known about it anyway. There was a fan project called Stage 9. It was a VR, well, it was a recreation of the Enterprise D. It was available on both desktop and in virtual reality. I preferred the virtual reality one, obviously, because I had the headset. It was really cool. And I still have a copy of that, but I'm not talking about using that. They did get basically told by CBS, stop. And so they kind of had to at that point, even though it was a fan project and wasn't for profit, and they allow fan films to actually raise money and everything. And okay, there's a whole argument there, but we don't need to get into that. However, silver lining is the Stage 9 people are now called Messy Desk, right? There's actually a Discord, and the Discord, Facebook, everything's back. But they're not Stage 9 anymore, and they were working on this super top secret project, and they did mention that we're sitting down. It was a property, and they had actually reached out to the people who owned it to ask if it would be okay if they did it, not as like a fully licensed profit thing, but like they were doing with the Enterprise thing, a completely free, non-profit fan project. But they didn't want to run into the problems they ran into with the TNG project, so they wanted to ask the creators first, and I believe they sat down, and then they were negotiating with it, and negotiations went well, and ultimately they were told, yeah, go for it. We know you're doing it, we think it's great, go ahead. It's a fan project, that's fine, go ahead. And they started putting up little teasers with it, and it's the Orville, right? For those of you who haven't seen the Orville, this is a perfect project for them to be doing, because it's got so much of the great stuff the Next Generation had. It's basically Seth MacFarlane's Star Trek. It's essentially what it is. It's more than that. It's finding its own identity as it goes on. So they're working on a recreation, both desktop and VR, of the Orville. And apparently it said about 3 to 4 weeks' time, I think one of the devs mentioned. They're hoping for a release, for the initial release, because like Stage 9, it's going to be frequent releases and updates. So, what I might do is, I think the Stage 9 people would be okay with it. And I know Seth MacFarlane is totally cool with the project, because they did reach out to his company. And he even himself actually retweeted the launch video on Twitter, which was really cool of him, because they didn't have to. That was very cool of him. So I think they would be okay with it, providing it's not a profit thing, it's just for fun. So when I'm doing my streams, because I like things where we can go around and we can look at stuff, but things that aren't too game intensive, is if we went on tours of the Orville. Or at least initially in a few weeks when it comes out. And I just realised I'm yammering on and on here, so I'm going to shut up now. So let me know what you think, or if you have any ideas yourselves. I do want to keep streams interesting, and I will take all your feedback on board and see what I can come up with. Okay, and with that, I'm heading off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.